it's a long way from the laboratory to commercial markets. So I don't know, maybe we might see something like practical in the fusion markets within by like the 2050s. Like the tech, once you actually like see the tech, it's easy to understand. Like it's very simple. It's very elegant in its simplicity. The implications are what really are tough to wrap your head around. Bitcoin's going to be a huge catalyst for nuclear power because it changes the financing time horizon dramatically, because Bitcoin aligns well with that low time preference, which is what you need to invest in a 40-year project that is like a nuclear power plant.
This podcast is entertainment, not financial, tax, or legal advice. Views expressed represent statements of the speaker in their individual capacity, do not represent the views of Unchained, and should not be considered investment advice. Speakers often have personal, family, or business connections to Unchained, which may include direct financial benefits. Please see our disclosure at unchained.com/podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bitcoin Frontier podcast. This week I have on Ryan, the nuclear Bitcoiner. Ryan, welcome.
Oh, it's nice to meet you, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Definitely glad to have you here. I want to start with, I guess, the basics and your background. Why are you the nuclear Bitcoiner?
It's kind of like a right place at the right time kind of story. I was primed to understand Bitcoin long ago. Like I had watched the Zeitgeist videos, learned about fractional reserve banking, and then went down that whole rabbit hole a long time ago, and then followed alternative media. Bitcoin came up a few times. Like I remember hearing Max ranting about it way back when, as most people have similar stories. But then I never really took it seriously until about 2021, end of 2022, when it started to have that big run up, and I had some that I had cashed out and left in a wallet and forgotten about. And then it grabs your attention when a few $100s is now a few $1,000s. Like, what the hell is this thing? And in the meantime, I had started working in that Canadian Nuclear Laboratories about 10 years earlier, just as a chemical technologist. So let's make it clear, I'm not a nuclear engineer, I'm not a scientist. I support a lot of that work, and I work in proximity to them. So by osmosis, I've learned a lot about the operations of nuclear reactors, and then just my own proclivity to learn about this stuff. It's just like I went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. I went hard down the nuclear rabbit hole. Like first it was just a job, and then it became like full on learn as much as I can about what's going on. And that got me attracted to the plans that Canada has with small modular reactors. That Canada's most famous in the nuclear space for the CANDU reactor. It's a unique design that doesn't require enriched uranium. That's one of the selling points that it has had for its existence. It's in operation in 5-6 different countries. Most of them are in Canada, primarily in Ontario, and there's a plan to build more. But then we're also branching out into more pathways to broaden the market for nuclear power, because yes, there's still going to be massive demand for the gigawatt scale reactors, as we are seeing like this huge demand from AI data centers and other sources. But there's also many small markets where gigawatt size reactors are not really appropriate, and like a few 100 megawatts would be more applicable, or even in some cases like microgrids in northern Canada, you were talking like 5-10 megawatts would be sufficient. So there's different reactor designs that are vying to apply to those different markets. As you spoke with Isaiah Taylor a few weeks ago, and Valor Atomics is working on a micro reactor. There's a company called Ultrasafe Nuclear Company, well, formerly a company called Ultrasafe Nuclear Company, but they recently went bankrupt, and so their assets were purchased by another company called Nano Nuclear. They're also in the same situation. There's others. There's a company called Terra Innovatum that's working on a 1 megawatt micro reactor design. So there's a lot of competition in this space and a rush to become the first to the market, because it's going to be a huge first mover advantage if you can get this thing rolling. But it was when I started learning about this, it was they came together at just the right time, when I was having a conversation with my wife around when Elon went from Bitcoin good, Tesla's going to take Bitcoin, to Bitcoin bad, Tesla's not going to take Bitcoin. And then I had been excited in explaining it to her enough that she was the one that put the idea in my head. It's like, well, why don't we just apply nuclear power to this Bitcoin mining if its carbon footprint is such an issue? And she was just kind of like, oh, yeah, that's just a whatever idea. It seems so common sense based on what you've been telling me. So, and then she just went back to what she was reading, and I just got absolutely captured by this idea and read tons of studies. And especially in the microgrid context, one of the biggest challenges of deploying nuclear power in a small grid is you're not going to have certainty that you're going to be able to sell all of that power, because typically you're going to have a variance between your low peak in the summer and your high peak in the winter. And in some cases that can be almost like twice as much between your low and your high. So it makes it challenging to build enough capacity to support your maximum peak load especially with the high capex of nuclear, when it's traditionally seen as just covering the base load. So you end up having that margin where it can be as much as like 30 to 40% of the power is going unused unless you have a uniquely suitable, flexible consumer that can fit in that space. And then obviously, like learning about the flexibility of Bitcoin mining and what they're doing on the flare gases, what Gridless is doing, it just felt like an obvious fit that Bitcoin mining fits all of the criteria to just arbitrage that stranded power, make value of it, and then kind of play a pioneer load kind of idea, though, as how Brandon Quinn frames it with the pioneer species, where the Bitcoin miners are the ones that kind of they make it more accommodating to build the energy system in the first place by monetizing the power in the early stages. And then as the community evolves into it, either they add more power or they taper down the Bitcoin miners. And then so that they're almost like migratory, and then they can move on to the next system and then the next system, and kind of the idea would be to cascade them as once they've served their role, the system's now self-sustaining, it's had more sophisticated energy buyers move into that market. And then, yeah, the miners, they will do what they do best and they will migrate to find better opportunities.
I like it. I definitely want to dive into a lot of those different subtopics for sure. When you look at nuclear compared to other types of energy sources, whether it's solar, wind, hydrocarbons, or whatever else, what makes you like more bullish on nuclear in comparison to those other sources?
The density has to be the biggest one because you can generate massive amounts of power with a very small footprint. You don't need to expand your transmission infrastructure. You don't need to use up massive amounts of land. And then you also don't have to deal with the problem that it seems that was just highlighted by what happened in Spain this week, when the wind starts getting very variable and clouds start rolling in, and then your grid frequency starts varying, because when you take a lot of your large spinning reserves, like your gas generators and your coal generators, they provide inertia to the grid, and that can often buffer those like short-term frequency variations. But as you reduce that inertia and add more intermittent like wind and solar, they don't provide that same capacity, and the grid just was not resilient enough to tolerate those fluctuations. And then the whole, yeah, like that was it, like 2/3 of their grid just went offline, and it was pretty eye-opening to the people that are advocating for pushing on like intermittent generation sources without consideration for the second order effects of how these energy systems work and integrate with each other. Because it's like the entire grid is one big machine that's synchronized with each other, like all throughout the United States and Canada. Like we're almost like one giant grid altogether. As when did that happen? Like 2005, 2006, when the power went out in New York and Ontario. It was something happened on a power line in Ohio. It was like a branch fell on a power line, and then it was just cascading trips that just took out the plant in Niagara Falls, and then that cascaded through most of New York and Ontario. So it's a very delicate system that's been built in a patchwork way over like the last century or so, and we've got very familiar with the types of generation that we've used, which is basically thermal generators. And now as we're transitioning, there's a lot of different consequences and effects that need to be considered when we're pushing on, yeah, lots more intermittent generation sources that aren't as controllable. We have to balance the load around them instead of them basically just providing a controlled load. Like we can ramp up coal plants up and down, we can ramp up gas plants up and down, but then that is their liability. Is like gas plants, all these plants would rather be operating most efficiently at a constant output. But then in the case of like peaker plants, like you're keeping these, you're to support the intermittent generation, you have to keep the peaker plants available as backup. So you're almost paying for that infrastructure in double, but then they're only operating 5-10% of the year. But then because that's when they capture most of their margins, they're almost incentivized to want to see the grid prices go as high as they possibly can before capturing it. And I can foresee similar dynamics playing out with batteries as well. There's going to be incentive that they want to capture the greatest margin. So then they want to see power prices go up, because as more batteries and more of these sources start to come onto the grid, they start cannibalizing each other's markets. And because, yeah, when all the solar and all the wind is pushing onto the grid at the same time, like the grid can only transmit so much through the transmission lines, they can only store so much. So it becomes a lot more juggling around the weather. And then on the other front is like, if we are so concerned about very unpredictable weather in the future, I see it as kind of foolish to be creating such a large dependency on weather-based energy sources. So like I'm more of a resilience guy, and like I'm and the other thing I saw yesterday too, there was a one of the nuclear advocacy groups. I don't like disparaging the other technologies to talk up my preferred technology. Like but it was pointing out that like yes, the nuclear accidents have been bad, but then it was going on about how pollution from coal plants and gas plants kills millions of people. But then it doesn't contextualize that the reason that there's 8 billion people on this planet is because of hydrocarbons, and you have to at least put that context in it. But anybody that disparages hydrocarbons these days seems to forget about the positive externalities of hydrocarbons, that they keep the lights on for people that would otherwise not have any other option.
Yeah, you brought up Spain and how they either had a blackout or were on the verge of a very extreme blackout, or maybe kind of a little bit of both, which I saw that and I thought that was pretty crazy and also kind of scary. With small modular nuclear reactors, is that if those become more common and start to get built out, will that enable the grid to be like a little bit more decentralized? Like, will there be like these microgrids that make everything a little more protected and insulated and resilient against an event like that?
In in theory, that is what they're going for. Is yeah, more decentralization in these grids, more resilience. Like in some ways, like many of these grids can already operate in island mode. Like ERCOT is an example. It's basically its own isolated section of the American grid, and then like the NISO can operate as an island, PJM can operate as an island, but they're also have neighbors and they have interconnections with their neighbors, and then there's power being exported and imported from Canada, from Quebec, and every which way. There's gas going the other way, and so there's all these different like markets for it. But yeah, like the SMRs, the idea is that we'll be able to create like a constellation of microgrids, and they'll be able to operate independently. But then we would still have interconnections between the two, so they can sell towards other grids as if that market, the demand is there. But then they would also have the option to completely island themselves. So if there is an issue elsewhere, they can be isolated and it doesn't affect them. Like you can see it in cases like Gridless has highlighted this, where there's cases like some of the cities will go out, but then the little villages that are being powered just on their little hydro dam, they're lit right up. So there's just
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Is kind of something that I've been thinking about. It's like, we have the tariff war going on right now, and like the idea of free trade in general is generally a good thing, right? Like, we trade with each other, and I produce something A very good, you produce something B very good, and we all benefit from that. And if we all wanted to be completely self-sufficient, then that means like we don't trade with each other, which is like a cool objective, but it's also like that's extremely hard to do. Like if I couldn't trade with each other, I would be hungry and at risk of danger probably to some extent. So it's like with these microgrids, it's kind of like would it be saying like that's the best of both worlds, where it's like you could become more resilient and on your own, but also you could still have your grid with some sort of interconnection with another grid, and then that would still be good. Like those grids could trade with each other if needed, but they don't necessarily have to.
yeah, it gives optionality. And then we also have the option now of essentially a virtual grid in the form of Bitcoin mining, where we can just place it anywhere, and you treat it in essentially the same way as like an export from your power grid.
Yeah, it's a great point. This is a question from Twitter. Obviously, like nuclear energy is not a majority of the global energy production. What do you think will be like the catalyst or tipping point for nuclear energy to really accelerate?
Well, I would say definitely this demand coming from AI and data centers is going to be a massive driver, as we've seen that the Susquehanna power plant has been an interesting case, because that was where Talon Energy started their data center, and then they sold off what they had, the second one that they were preparing, to Amazon. But then that ran into a problem of now, I believe PGM is the grid that's on, but they were issuing a concern that now if you're pulling a gigawatt off of the grid, now that's not contributing to all of the just like the ongoing operation and maintenance costs of the transmission line. So then that's going to put those costs disproportionately on the user base, because now that data center is using power before it even reaches the grid. So there's a lot of things to work out there. And then, but I think that is also what prompted now Microsoft to say that they want to purchase 3 Mile Island, and they just want it all, and they want to basically operate it as an island for their data center. They don't even want to have anything to do with the grid, because that is a complicated process, because you have to balance, like, what if your power goes offline and then you need to now start drawing a gigawatt from the grid, and then that's going to have all different external consequences that need to be ironed out before they can start putting these massive data centers into action. So there's a lot more interest in doing them as like industrial data center microgrids, and they would be like a massive set of power generation infrastructure, probably like 2, 3, 4 nuclear power plants, and then they would be supporting various industrial processes, data centers, and then you can also get dual use out of some of the data centers, as we're seeing with like the Bitcoin miners. Like if you can put the heat to service in doing other work, like you can get it kind of double dip on your energy costs. But because of the value that the AI guys are getting, they're not as inclined to do that, whereas the Bitcoin miners are scraping every penny they can get out of their hash rate. So hash rate heating has become a very niche, a niche within a niche within a niche that is very, very exciting these days. But yeah, there's just so much opportunity to build power now, like from all of these different countries. Like Poland wants to build a lot of nuclear power. There's a bunch of countries throughout Europe that are looking at nuclear power. There was at the last year's COP conference, they announced that they want to triple nuclear capacity, and there was like 22 countries were signed on to that. Several of them were African countries, like Canada was definitely on there. But the one thing that was ironic to notice about the list of countries that had made that pledge, the 3 countries that are actively building nuclear power plants right now were not on that list, and that's China, Russia, and India, which like they're actually doing it while everyone else in the West is kind of just like, yay, we're going to make this pledge. So it's like, okay, let's see some action, guys. Like there's right now there's a lot of changes going on with the NRC and what was it, like that Exxon doctrine, where it was like they were kind of like governing regulation through like the legal system, and that's completely changed. I don't know like the exact details, but it's going to force the NRC to have a lot like a different relationship with the industry, because it was predominantly designed around the big reactors, and now it needs to adapt to, now there's like these smaller reactors that have smaller fuel loads, so they need smaller exclusion zones around the site. So that's why many of these micro reactors are targeting less than 10 megawatts, because if the NRC is applying the regulation by the book, then they technically don't need an exclusion zone. So that significantly reduces the design envelope and the initial capex of building these things in the first place. So it'll make it a lot easier to deploy them if you don't need to have 2-3 kilometers around the site just completely isolated. Whereas like these little ones, because of their minimal fuel load and their lower security risk, they can be placed like within a better proximity to the demand centers that they're going to be servicing. And then
Interesting.
yeah, and then you can just like Isaiah said, you can just stack multiples on top of each other and to get the scale that you're looking for.
Gotcha. So it's like there's kind of a way to build these smaller nuclear reactors that now makes more sense. And at the same time, there's more demand for energy in general with AI data centers, Bitcoin miners, and so many other applications for just energy. That's kind of like the view is like we have the current base of energy production that may continue operating. And then when we need more energy, the more clear solution for building that or for generating that energy is going to be nuclear, and potentially the form of like smaller nuclear reactors.
Yeah, and like the idea is once the technology is mature, we'll be able to deploy these reactors, like the micro reactors, a lot faster than a traditional like gigawatt scale reactor. Like because the most recent examples of Vogel and Flamanville, Hinkley Point C, and was it Oikkoluoto, the one in Finland, they were over budget, way over schedule, and it doesn't look good on the industry. It makes it look like we've lost what we were capable of. But then you go back into like the 70s and like the US, Canada, we were France, we were building dozens of these things at a time, and it was just one after another. But then something seemed to have happened sometime in the 70s. And if you look at the chart that shows the financing of nuclear reactors, about 1973, flat lines. And
Hmm.
to us Bitcoiners, like, well, WTF happened in 1971? I have no doubt that plays a contributory role. Like, it's not the full extent of why it became so much challenging to finance nuclear power. But then, yeah, I was just reading
Bitcoin isn't just a balance sheet asset, it's the benchmark. On May 14th at 11 a.m. Central Time, Unchained and Strive are hosting a live online event. The discussion will explore why capital allocation is being redefined through a Bitcoin lens, how performance looks different when measured in sound money, and why building a Bitcoin treasury is critical. RSVP at unchained.com/frontier. That's unchained.com/frontier.
some guy just did a brief thread on financing nuclear power, and he was just going through, like, back before the 70s, it was mostly these companies, they would have strong balance sheets, they would have good reputations, and they were capable of building things, and that was the way that it was done. And then after the 70s, it changed, like their debt financing structure changed to be more adaptive to the fiat system, and it just didn't jive with nuclear power. And that's one of the reasons that I think Bitcoin is going to be a huge catalyst for nuclear power, because it changes the financing time horizon dramatically, because Bitcoin aligns well with that low time preference, which is what you need to invest in a 40-year project that is like a nuclear power plant. And you also have to be considering things like its end of life. Like, nuclear power plants, one of the reasons why their capex is so high is they have to account for the cost of decommissioning and waste management. And that's, like, not all of it, but a good chunk of that gets front loaded. And then they're also contributing to that as part of their ongoing operating costs. Like, a portion per kilowatt hour goes to a pool that then it gets grouped together to support all those activities for various stakeholders that require those services at that time. And then there's also insurance is a challenging one for the nuclear industry because of its disproportionately treated more dangerous than other comparable technologies, which is debatable, but it's a poorly understood phenomenon, radiation. So it creates it. It's easy to be fearful of something that you don't understand. And then, but as it comes with education, like, more people start understanding. Like, a lot of people aren't even familiar about, like, the medical applications of nuclear radiation and nuclear technology. Like, I have no doubt that everybody listening to this knows at least somebody that has had a medical procedure that has involved some sort of radiological isotope, whether it was just sterilizing the materials with cobalt 60, or it was like a moly 99 treatment, or like yeah, there's dozens of different isotopes that are used for treating various diseases and for sterilizing medical grids. And it's good used in agriculture. It's used in archaeology. Like, there's all kinds of different applications of radiation beyond just generating power. That's just one aspect of it, and that's the most known because it's the biggest ticket item aside from nuclear weapons. But that's a whole different ballpark.
Yeah. I want to know your thoughts on this. We have obviously nuclear fission today. It's mainly nuclear power plants. Like, what about nuclear fusion? Like, is that going to be a possibility in the future? Have you done research on that idea? And, like, what is that? And for people that don't even know, like, what is fission compared to fusion?
Yeah. So if anyone was listening to your talk with Isaiah, he was explaining that fission is when a radiological atom, particularly the uranium 235, it gets struck by a neutron, and then it splits apart, and then it splits probabilistically around, like, the 95 and the 130 atomic mass units. So you'll get, like, a chunk of it will be in the 90s and a chunk of it will be in the 130s, and it's not always the exact same split. It's probabilistic as to what will come out of it. So yeah, so fission is breaking apart and harvesting that energy that is released when that happens. And then fusion is the opposite. It's taking two molecules, like two hydrogen, or, well, in most cases, it's going to be like tritium and lithium, and forcing them together, but they have a very strong magnetic repulsion. So the energy required to actually overcome that is substantial. But once you do overcome that barrier, the energy that can be released from that is orders of magnitude more than the energy that was required to create it in the first place. The challenge is harnessing it because it is a lot of energy. So actually containing it with like physical materials is not easy. So there's a lot of work on like magnetic fields in order to contain it. And that also requires a ton of energy. So there's a lot of work, and there's been some interesting breakthroughs at the laboratory scale, but it's a long way from the laboratory to commercial markets. So I don't know, maybe we might see something like practical in the fusion markets by like the 2050s. But like in the meantime, we are very familiar with fission. We have different reactor types and designs that have just been kind of on the shelf since the 60s and 70s. That they're perfectly viable. They just they chose the LWR reactors because they were easily repeatable, and that was essentially what got put into mass production. That's just light water reactors. And then the Canada on the opposite side, you use a heavy water reactor. But it's basically all the same principle. You're boiling water, you run it through a steam turbine, you generate electricity, and then the other designs, like the one that Isaiah mentioned, it's a high temperature gas reactor. It uses helium as its coolant. There's others that use molten salts as their coolants. There's others that use graphite as their coolant, and it's all just about dissipating that heat, capturing it in a secondary fluid, typically water, and then running it through a steam turbine. And then you can also, because some of these other mediums that they want to use, like the high temperature gas and the molten salts, they can achieve higher operating temperatures than just water, because water you're limited to like even under pressure upwards of like 200 degrees Celsius. So if we can start having output temperatures for steam in the 600 degrees Celsius, that also opens up a lot more heat applications for the nuclear industry. Like there's still a large range, like up into like the 11, 12, 1300 degrees Celsius, but that can also be covered by induction furnaces. So if you're just using electricity to heat things up by induction, you can still achieve the same output as the outcomes as using like the coked coal to use those high temperatures, but you're just using electricity, but it requires a ton of electricity for those induction furnaces. So it's the idea is you want to drive down the cost of that electricity so low that you can operate those high heat applications.
So your view with fusion and fission is like fission works well today. We can build it today. We can build these small modular nuclear reactors, whereas fusion is like would be a really awesome technology, but it just doesn't exist today in a way that we can engineer that's sustainable and really helpful. And so it's best to, in the more short term, focus on building out normal fission reactors. Is that right?
Yeah, and then you'd even, if in the energy space, you'd encounter the argument that even nuclear fission takes too long. We should be building windmills and solar panels, and that because we can build them now, we can build them cheap, but then that also ignores how much they're subsidized and heavily dependent on tax credits and the way that they'll shift ownership once the tax credits are no longer available, and then that leaves someone else holding the bag and being exposed to their real operating costs or being responsible for their end of life and decommissioning, which, as we've seen, like many people have probably seen the windmill panels buried in a field beside a tiny little bulldozer, and just showing that like we don't really have a plan for these things. And even if they were recyclable, like it's so much cheaper to just bury them in the ground and forget them than pay like probably 20 times more to actually process them. Same thing with like photovoltaics. And it always just feels like they were never properly exposed to the full market cost of doing business. So they have all the subsidies and the tax credits almost like hide those externalities. And then when they get exposed, and it's just like, oh, now we need the government to come in and fund the solar panel recycling. And then I give the opposite argument. It's like they should never have been picking winners and losers in these markets to begin with, because they're the ones that created this distortion where now there's so much windmills and solar panels on the grid that they're cannibalizing each other's markets. And then they also throw off the markets for any like nuclear power plants that are on the same grid too, because if you change the stack of which generators getting priority, you sometimes, like if the sun comes up and blasts up, like you'll see it sometimes on the ERCOT grid, when they get that burst of sun in the early day, you can see the nuclear baseload is just flat most of the time, but then as that sun comes on, you'll just see a little tick down in the nuclear, and then it'll come back up. But it's like the nuclear plant should just be left at 100% all the time and never be disrupted by this. But they almost have to do that and almost to balance the glut of power just coming onto the grid so quickly when so much, like solar hits all at once. Just like you can see it in the California grid, there's just like this huge yellow hump right in the middle of their grid, and then there'll be like a little bit of batteries that come off the backside, but then reliably, yeah, they've got a band of nuclear at the bottom, and then they've got their gas and coal that supports the base load, and then everything else just sits on top of that. So I think we can fill in a lot more space with nuclear and without much issue. We just need to add more flexibility.
Mm-hmm. And that flexibility is Bitcoin mining.
It
Is that
in many cases, yeah, like because I've heard many cases of like uh what was it that report that the Bitcoin Policy Institute did about the different load profiles of the AI and the Bitcoin mining data centers, and I just compared like, yeah, the AI wants to be on all the time. It doesn't really tolerate the disruption as well as the Bitcoin miners do. And then also the Bitcoin miners, you kind of got your tiers, like your high end ASICs you want to be running all the time, but then you got like your older
right?
ones you can tolerate a little bit more downtime. So that we're seeing a lot more strategies that are playing that. But like, yeah, there's no reason why you couldn't take like an AI data center and then just fill 10% of its with the Bitcoin miners, and then that creates an immense amount of flexibility for them, and then they can have that to balance out their position in those grids. And and yeah, so I see a lot of symbiosis between these two types of loads, and it's probably also going to evolve to like there's going to be AI loads, machine learning loads, edge computing loads that are going to start developing degrees of flexibility. But at the moment and until then, like I don't see anything that can even compare to what the Bitcoin miners can offer on in that regard.
Yep, I agree with that. Um, Back on the topic of fusion, and I'm not an expert in obviously nuclear energy or quantum computing, but it kind of reminds me of quantum computing, where it's like here's this crazy new innovative technology, fusion and quantum, that you know is definitely possible that we create one day and are able to harness that technology, but we still need at least one or many 1 0 to 1 innovations that are really going to like turn those technologies into something that humans can use like on a daily basis or whatnot. And like maybe when they exist, like they'll be very helpful for various applications, but both of those are still a ways away, I guess.
Very, in all probability, yes. To like at least to the degree that most people think it's going to be world changing. Like it'll probably be a gradually then suddenly thing. Like we'll hear updates and then just all of a sudden it's here. And like I
Yeah.
find like even just with the AI in general, just the different degrees to which different people are using it. Like I interact with people that are using it very heavily, and then I interact with people that aren't using it at all, and they don't even like know what it's capable of, and
Yeah.
they're going to be caught very off guard in the not too distant future because it is accelerating at a phenomenal pace. And like I typically just use it like for complex like Excel formulas or just like riffing on ideas, and just as a sounding board for yeah for getting my thoughts clear on some of these complex ideas, because it's easy to get disorganized when there's many different layers to how we can start applying like the Bitcoin mining into the nuclear, and then it has the mining side, but it also has the financing side. So there's a lot of puzzle pieces that are starting to come together, and just trying to envision what that can look like going forward is a it's fun but challenging, and predicting trends, yeah, it's not easy, especially with the way that Bitcoin goes up and down and all over the place. But yeah, I look at that 4 year moving average, and I'm just like just up and to the right. Let's just stay confident. We will get through. We will get to where we're going.
Yeah. Yeah, you brought up how like fast everything is accelerating, and I completely agree. And it's going to be really interesting to see, what happens over the coming decades, because it's like even today, the world that my grandparents grew up in is very different, and like they are definitely not interacting with ChatGPT on a daily basis. They also are not stacking Bitcoin on a daily basis, and it's like if the acceleration and new technology continues to accelerate, then it's like different age groups are going to be so disconnected from each other to some extent. And maybe like, there's going to be some people that, understood Bitcoin very early and obtained an immense amount of wealth. And then there's going to be another generation that is perhaps like so far behind the ball that they're still, not even using ChatGPT or have no idea how Bitcoin works. Do you have any thoughts on like how that's going to play out with this rapid acceleration?
Odds are it'll probably just manifest in a user interface where they don't even know that they're interacting with it. We'll have like an iPhone moment where it's just there was a subset of the population that was deep into the internet, and then nobody else even touched it until you could put it in their hand. And like,
Yeah.
because like I still remember, yeah, the old dial-up days, and being of the last generation that still remembers a pre-internet time, and it's a different world that my children are growing up into, and having to prepare them for, like with the AI, like for example, like the way that they're trying to frame it in school is just like, we don't want you to use the AI to, like, you don't want them to abuse the AI to do the work for them, but it's also like it's an immensely efficient learning tool if you're struggling through different sections. Like my one daughter, she had a lesson about it was about bartering. So all we did is we just took two AIs on two different tabs, and we were just like, okay, you're the seller and you're the buyer, and we just created a scenario for them to start bartering with each other, and then started adding more variables, and she made it like develop into like almost like a sophisticated economy, and then like introduce different variables, like, oh, here's something that can be used as money, and like they actually started collecting in one item for the purpose of trade. Like it developed almost naturally, and it was weird when you let this stuff go long enough. But then like I read, have you read Jesse Meyer's most recent piece, the once in a species one? Like that, yeah, that blew me away. Like, because now we're talking like Bitcoin may be the culmination of humans just being obsessed with scarce things, and we finally created the most perfectly scarce thing, and we create it with electricity, and so now that creates an incentive to generate such immense amounts of electricity that we can't even conceive it. Like I had put this idea out, I think it was when I did Cedric's podcast like a long time ago, but there will probably be a point in the probably like few decades where Bitcoin mining is consuming more power than the entire human civilization is using today, but it will probably still be roughly the same fraction of a percent that it is today. Like it, it'll be like Bitcoin will be using like 1% of all the energy, but that 1% will represent everything that we're using today, because we will have gone, that's so off the scale, pushing towards like the Kardashev, like level one, level
Yeah.
two. Like it's not even going to be fathomable, the world that my great grandchildren are going to grow up in compared to what we're dealing with now. Like the change is just astounding. And when we empower more people, then there's more innovation. Like especially if we start bringing this stuff to and empowering like Africa, like hearing the stories of what gridless is doing. Like some of these people are just getting their first light bulbs and refrigerators. Like that is revolutionary to unlock those minds and that talent that's there. But they're just trapped in cycles of poverty for various reasons. As if anybody that's read Alex Gladstein's books, yeah, I've got Hidden Repression right there, and yeah, that basically explains a lot about why parts of the world are better off than others.
Yeah, you made some really great points there. I want to talk about Bitcoin in particular a little more. You brought up the idea of like, okay, you had Jesse Meyer's piece talking about like the importance of humans respecting scarcity effectively over time. To me, it's like once you Bitcoin is a pretty simple tool in the sense that like it's a monetary tool, it's censorship resistant, and it's perfectly scarce, right? Why do you think more people haven't grasped that idea of perfect scarcity? Like what do you think is the biggest hurdle for the next wave of adoption? Are people just like stuck in their daily lives and they just don't really care, or volatility like confuses them and they get stuck on that? I'm curious how you think about that.
Yeah, definitely the volatility catches a lot of people up, because well, they're like, as Jeff Booth likes to say, like, when you're comparing it against the dying system, you're going to end up with distorted perceptions of what volatility actually means. Like, yeah, it's volatile, slowly grinding upwards towards the right, where yeah, the US dollar, it's great, it's stable, grinding slowly downwards towards the right. So it's like it's all relative, really. But like, yeah, and I also think like the tech, once you actually like see the tech, it's easy to understand. Like it's very simple in it's very elegant in its simplicity, but then the implications are what really are tough to wrap your head around, because for most cases it requires rewiring a lot of what you thought you understood about the world, especially if you've gone through the Keynesian indoctrination camps. Um, but like a lot of people are not willing to put in that work to reevaluate what they think they knew. Like I still talk to people that will argue that yeah, the 2% inflation rate target is a great thing because otherwise people would never spend their money. It's like yes, theft is essential for an economy to function. That makes perfect sense. But it's just there's some mental hurdles that need to be overcome, and there's just going to be people that are just going to be dragged along whether they like it or not. And yeah, the people like us that have figured this thing out earlier, if it is what we all have kind of rallied around, this Schelling point of sorts, that we are going to be greatly benefited, and our future generations will greatly benefit it as well, if as long as we can effectively transmit the lessons that we've been learning through time through our generations. So we will see.
Yep. I want to ask you about bit bonds, as that's obviously been an interesting topic, both among nation states and then also just around like MicroStrategy's convertible bonds, like basically, any sort of like Bitcoin collateralized bond. Do you have any thoughts on that in regards to either nation states or even just the nuclear or energy industry in of itself?
Yes, I do. The first time I heard Andrew Hones talk about this, I was just like, that may be an even more effective tool for the nuclear industry to finance these things than mining itself. Like mining's great because it's going to fill in that supply and demand margin, and then in theory you can then overbuild, and then you get better cost per unit, better financing terms and all that. But then, yeah, the spit bond thing came up, and he described how he applied it to an apartment complex, just oversized the loan by I think it was like 10 to 15%, and then as long as Bitcoin um, appreciates, I think he said somewhere around like 6 or 7% per year. At the end of the loan term, that Bitcoin will be able to completely retire the principal, and then they'll be able to recycle that into like the next loan and the next loan. So when I first heard that, I was like, that would apply very well to these nuclear projects, especially like the small nuclear projects. You could almost like have each financing structure, like each deployment have its own kind of finance on it, independent from other ones. And then as they start like generating the flows and getting off the grounds and then evolving, then you can cascade it into the next one and then the next one and then the next one. So as if it plays out the way that we are expecting Bitcoin to do, like yeah, that appreciation is going to be much faster than the inflation rate or the coupon rate that you're paying out for it. And then yeah, you could be paying overall on the cost of the loan. Like typically if you're doing, I worked it out like a 21 million dollar loan at a 5% coupon, you're paying back almost like 31 million. But then if you were to do 20%, oversize that by 20% and then put that as Bitcoin, and then I just used Saylor's 21 model and just put in the bear case and the base case, and then you work out that like yeah, the cost of the loan is like double digit percents less than what it would be if you're just doing the traditional structure. And you, in some of these cases, when you work out the math, like you'll still have some Bitcoin left over to then you can recycle that into the next project, use it as collateral and whatnot. And then the idea too is because nuclear is typically risk averse, you're going to have a tranche of traditional investors that don't want to have anything to do with Bitcoin. So you can offer them just like a standard senior note where they get first priority. And then for the more risk tolerant or adventurous, like the Bitcoiners, now you can create a product for them where you just like offer, like split it 50-50, and then you have the second tranche goes towards Bitcoiners, and then they will take ideally take like a lower interest rate or coupon rate, but they would be offered a more on the appreciation of the Bitcoin, so they could benefit from that. And then there would also be the way that Andrew explains it is that then you have aligned incentives between all these parties, like actually because the longer that the loan term goes, the more the Bitcoin appreciates, and then everybody ends up benefiting the longer that you can at least meet the minimum obligations and then just keep that term going. So there's a lot of potential for this to be applied to various nuclear applications, especially small modular reactors. Like I can't get into too much detail, but I was speaking with a CFO from one of these SMR companies recently, and And like he was very interested in the mining and the different ways the mining could go. But then when I explained the bit bonds to him, and as a finance guy, he was just like, this might be like what we're looking for. And you could see the wheels spinning in his head, and he's like, there might be something here worth looking at. And then now you've got tranches of Bitcoin like locked up for periods. So then you can also see it'd be like the opposite of the hodl waves where we can see that backwards looking. Now we could see we would have like flows of Bitcoin that would be coming to maturity in these different collateralized loan structures. And you could almost have a forward looking market that can anticipate when different tranches would be released back into the market. There's a lot of moving parts to it, but like, yeah, and Andrew explains it far more eloquently than I can, but I believe that, yeah, the bit bonds can be a huge tool in financing nuclear projects. And then on top of that, yeah, there's like ways that you can use Lightning, turn your power plant into your like financial hub. And then if they could have do something like Synoda, where then the consumers are paying the utility through Lightning channels, and then you can set up reverse flow to compensate the consumers for like conservation efforts. So if you want them to lower their energy uses, you can stream sats back to them at a rate that they set, and then the whole grid can like aggregate these different set points that people would be tolerant of. Like, say they'll set 1 degree down at 100 sats per minute, but then if they want to go down 2 degrees, they'll set that at like 5,000 sats per minute. But then your neighbor might have 500 for the first degree and then only 1,000 for the second degree, and then that can be aggregated in an interesting way, and we can use the Lightning Network infrastructure at two-way channels, just like Synoda is already using it as a one-way. And instead of rebates, it's real-time settlement for compensation for these programs, instead of just opt in and then the grid just takes control of your thermostat whenever they want. Yeah, and then on top of that, like we're seeing like the hash rate derivatives are a way to like kind of stabilize your revenue, and so that's something that like the very risk-averse nuclear industry would be like to do. So they, instead of even like doing with the Bitcoin, they can just sell hash rate, and then they can just take dollars at whatever the forward hash price is at the time, and then that can also bring capital forward depending on the scale of your mining operations. And there's probably not going to very likely going to be some sort of like block space futures as well, where they're basically selling block space to potential clients, whether it on chain or out of band. Like I think like Marathon already has like the slipstream, which is essentially that idea where they're just selling block space to preferred clients. And there's going to be various ways that that's going to be applied. And like even on like the nation states, like it's inevitable that they'll probably want to whitelist and blacklist each other. And like if they want to actually have any influence on that whatsoever, like you can only do so much, because like, yeah, okay, if you have 10% of the mining and you don't want to service anything from country X, go right ahead, somebody else will, and you won't have anything from the country you blacklisted in your blocks. Like, it goes against like the Bitcoin ethos, but nation states are going to do what nation states do, and it's inevitable that they're going to join this party, and we're going to have to adapt to that. And yeah, there's just and like yeah, like nation states, they're going to want to have their own hash rate. They're going to need their own hash rate, and that's what I'm advocating for. Like, because some of the talk that I've had was that Bitcoin is polarizing because Donald Trump likes it. And then when I hear things like Donald Trump wants all the Bitcoin to be mined in America, like, I love the guy's enthusiasm on such a thing, and that's not quite how it works. But then I'd also argue, like, well, in order to countervail that, if you're an adversarial nation, like, you have to out mine what they do in America. It's not about like, if you ignore it, you have no say whatsoever. But if you want to, if you want to be competitive, you have to play the game, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are a lot of interesting topics. I wish we could talk for longer, but this is good. Two more rapid fire questions, then we can close it out. What's something that you believe that most Bitcoiners would disagree with?
Oh God, I don't even know. My head is just filled with so much podcasts and stuff rolling around. Like probably just what I just said. Like, I believe that nation states are going to get into this. They're going to play their games with whitelists and blacklists, and it's going to piss off a lot of the Bitcoiners. And as we can see right now, like with this little op return conflagration that's going on, like it seems like the entire Bitcoin Twitter sphere is having a mental breakdown. But like, if something like this is enough to take down Bitcoin, like, it wasn't going to make it anyways. So I think we're going to come through this fine. We're going to deal with nation states just fine, but they're going to have a completely different set of priorities as to how they use the network. And there's really only so much we can do about it because it's an open source protocol and we're all just
Yep.
playing by the same rules.
Yeah. That's a great point. Last one. What do you think is the biggest risk to Bitcoin?
God, risk. Just apathy, probably. Just, but then like you see that there's so many people that care a lot about keeping this flame alive. Like you got like Bill Burnett or Bob Burnett, like really hyping up we have to decentralize the mining pools, and now we're seeing Ocean and what's the other one? The demand pool that pop up recently that are giving miners more control over the templates that they create, and it just seems that all the problems that manifest, they find a way to work themselves out because somebody within the ecosystem will take it on themselves to be the lead cheerleader for such a topic. And like Bob wields a lot of influence in this space, and it clearly manifested in Ocean Pool, and they are doing very well. And it seems that like many other large miners are migrating in that direction. So it's very, very good to see. But yeah, if we do not have people that will react like that, like the immune system or like the cyber hornets, then yeah, it could all be for nothing. But it's fascinating just seeing it because like so many people, like the detractors, I find almost see it as a static thing, but then we are involved in it. Like we are part of an unfolding process through time. It's almost like the blockchain already exists and we're just participating in how it's being built. Like actually, I read this book recently. I only just finished this big 4-parter, and like I'm recommending it a lot more. It's called Hyperion. I first heard about it because Mandrick promoted he promoted it on Walker's podcast a few months ago, and then I read through this and it was very much aligned with the Bitcoin ethos. There's a lot of stuff about time, and there's and like a what is they call it? The void that binds, and it almost like this void that binds feels like very much like this idea that Jesse was putting forward with just like there's just a common thread that connects humanity from our like kind of genesis point that into like what that certain people over time are able to tap into it and kind of be more empathetic with the rest of humanity and their fellow man. And it's just it seems that like Bitcoin may be realigning us with like these ideas. Like it's a huge 4-part series. It'll take like almost 60 hours to get through, but definitely one that is worth it for the Bitcoiners that are into fiction.
Well, yeah, that's a great suggestion, and I definitely agree with your overall thoughts. Like I do think Bitcoin is far from perfect, but it does historically seem to be anti-fragile, and if things go wrong, it gets fixed, and then also can get fixed before things break to begin with. So, Ryan, I think
We're already talking about quantum, like
yeah,
excessively.
Exactly. Ryan, this has been an awesome conversation. I really appreciate your time to do this. Where can the audience go find you after they listen to this?
Yeah, typically Nuclear Bitcoiner on X, on Noster, and then yeah, Ryan McLeod on LinkedIn if you want to go the more professional route. But I'm always open to hearing more from other people. Anybody that has critiques of these ideas, anywhere that it might not be as amazing as I like to think that it might be. I love to hear these ideas. I was challenged very well at one of the conferences I went to at the International Youth Nuclear Congress a few years ago. But like that's what I almost find I prefer to be challenged, so then I can really hone my ideas, my thoughts. Because yeah, when you're just preaching to the choir, then yeah, you can only get so far. So that's why I'm focusing a lot more of my attention on bringing these ideas to the nuclear audience than the Bitcoin audience. Because like yeah, the Bitcoiners they just want to know when they can get their hands on nuclear power, but it's the nuclear sector that has no idea how much that they are going to benefit when they start adopting these ideas, and whoever moves first is going to have an outsized advantage if it plays out the way that we expect it will. And yeah, I'm along for the ride.
I love it. Well, Ryan, thanks again. This was great, and thanks everybody for tuning in.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Joe.